At the My Family reunion, they sat me and my daughter Ella at a table, so far off to the side, it felt like we were waiting to be let in. No one came to greet us at the door. No arms opened for a hug. No friendly faces pointed to saved seats or welcomed us with warmth. Instead, we were ushered to two plain metal folding chairs wedged near the swinging kitchen door, like someone had remembered us last minute and panicked. Ella scanned the room with her big, thoughtful eyes, trying to understand where we fit into this puzzle of smiling faces and shared histories. I leaned in close, gave her a small, practiced smile, and said, "Looks like we've got the best seats in the house closest to the food." She smiled back politely, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Truthfully, neither was I. We had barely sat down when I heard the unmistakable sound of teenage cattiness from a few tables over. Madison, my sister, Diane's daughter, tilted her head toward another cousin and let out a whisper that wasn't really a whisper at all. "She's not even a real cousin." She said, her voice just loud enough to slice through the clatter of dishes and low conversation. It wasn't meant for everyone, but it was definitely meant for us. Ella stiffened. Her spine straightened like a drawn bowstring, and her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. I felt a rush of heat rise in my chest. I wanted to say something to throw words like a shield around her, but I didn't. Not because I didn't care, God, I cared, but because I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to give them more reason to look at us like we were a mistake someone forgot to erase. But then Ella did something that startled me. She rose slowly, her movements calm but deliberate, and unzipped the little lavender purse she had insisted on bringing. I figured it only held her chapstick and maybe the pocket-sized journal she carried everywhere. But instead, she pulled out a photo, one I hadn't seen in years. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her steps were sure as she walked across the dining room. The room was still abuzz with casual chatter, but it began to quiet as she reached the center. She held up the photo with both hands, her small voice steady and clear. "This is my dad," she said. "His name was Michael Morgan. He used to own this house." And just like that, everything stopped. Forks hovered in midair. Conversations broke off in the middle of words. It was as if someone had paused the whole scene. You could feel the tension thick as fog settle over the room. And in that suspended moment, the little girl they had tried to push into the margins became the center of everything. "My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 38. A single mom. And if I'm telling you the truth, I've spent most of my adulthood keeping my distance from family gatherings like this one. Not because I wanted to, but because I learned a long time ago that just because you share a last name doesn't mean the door you walk through will feel like home on the other side." Ella is 11. She's got this quiet, grounded kind of confidence that I envy. Like she already understands who she is and doesn't need the world's permission to exist boldly. But she also has this ache in her, this deep, steady longing to belong somewhere, to know stories, to connect dots I've never had the heart to share, especially when it comes to her dad. Mike, her father, was everything I never realized I needed. He was warm in ways that felt like sunlight, steady like roots, and the only man who ever made me feel like love didn't have to be earned. We weren't married, just two kids trying to figure things out, building a future that was still half painted. Then, one day, that future ended. A car accident, early December. He was on his way home from work. I was 3 months pregnant. In one breath, everything we dreamed of was gone. After Mike died, his side of the family pulled back. No fights, no harsh words. Just a silence that grew longer with each passing week. At first, I thought they were grieving. Everyone grieves differently, right? But when weeks became months and months slipped into years without a call or a card, the truth became clearer. Ella and I weren't part of the Morgan family anymore, if we ever had been. I didn't tell Ella much about that part. I focused on the good, how Mike used to read to her through my belly, how he had already picked her name before we ever saw her face. I kept his memory golden, soft-edged, and safe. I let her build her picture of him from laughter and lullabies, not from absence and rejection. So when a glossy envelope arrived in the mail embossed in gold with the words "Morgan Family Reunion," hosted at the family estate, I didn't know how to feel. It was from Aunt Carol, Mike's aunt, and the family's quiet queen bee. I hadn't spoken to her in more than a decade. At first, I planned to ignore it. I left the envelope sitting on the kitchen counter unopened for almost a week. But Ella found it. She read the invitation twice, then looked up at me with wide, searching eyes. "Do they want to meet me?" she asked. And that question, it landed like a stone in my chest. I didn't know how to answer, but I couldn't let her grow up with that question echoing in her bones. I couldn't let her wonder if she was never wanted, never seen, never enough to claim. So I said yes. Enam and kind. We set out on that gray-skied Saturday morning, the kind where the clouds hang low enough to touch, casting the winding country roads in a gentle, melancholic light. The air outside smelled of earth and anticipation. Ella sat beside me in the car, her knees pulled up just slightly, eyes glued to the changing tapestry of trees outside her window, burnished golds, rust-tinged reds, and fading greens, all flickering past like memories we hadn't yet lived. The road twisted and curled like a ribbon, pulling us deeper into a past I hadn't walked through in over a decade. And then, as we turned the final bend there, it was the old Morgan house. Time had barely touched it. The white clappered siding stood crisp against the autumn sky, the broad wraparound porch still hugging the front like an embrace long withheld. That ancient oak in the yard, the one Mike had climbed barefoot as a boy stretched its limbs heavenward, as if he might still return to scale it. As the car crunched up the gravel driveway, Ella's voice broke the silence. "Wow," she whispered reverently. "This is where he lived." I nodded, my heart a tight fist in my chest. "This is where your dad grew up," I murmured barely above a breath. "It's where he asked me to prom. Right from that front door." She turned toward me with a smile that felt sacred, like she was holding my words as one might a fragile artifact. When we stepped inside, the scent of lemon polish and time-worn wood wrapped around us like a memory. The hallway breathed familiarity, family portraits, dusty frames, the echo of footsteps too long absent. I recognized some of the faces in the photos along the wall, though many had aged into strangers, their smiles fossilized in time. A few heads turned as we entered. Some nodded politely. None of them moved. No one crossed the floor to greet us, to pull us into the fold with a hug or a cheerful welcome. Instead, we were gently yet unmistakably guided to a modest side table tucked at the edge of the dining room. The real gathering stretched out before us like a banquet of lineage, and belonging each name card arranged like pieces of a family heirloom puzzle. Except for ours simply read guests. The sting of that word hit sharper than I'd expected. Not Rachel and Ella, not Morgan's, just guests printed in small, tidy letters. I tried to soften the moment. "Hey," I whispered to Ella with a grin. "At least we're closest to the dessert." She chuckled, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly, but her eyes, those deep, searching eyes, betrayed her thoughts. She was watching everything, feeling everything. And then, like a drop of ink in clear water, the moment soured. Madison 13, all edge and bravado with the smirk of someone too young to understand the wounds her words could cause, leaned across to another cousin and whispered, "She's not even a real cousin." But it wasn't really a whisper. It was a scalpel sharpened to be heard. I felt Ella flinch beside me, not visibly, not in any obvious way, but I saw it in the subtle way her shoulders rose, in the tightening of her lips, in the way her gaze darted to me as though seeking protection. And in that second I failed her. Not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. I stayed quiet. I didn't challenge Madison. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there pretending I hadn't heard, because sometimes silence feels safer than confrontation. The room bustled around us, laughter, clinking cutlery, the rhythm of a family in full swing, but none of it reached our little table by the kitchen. From where we sat, it all felt staged, like a play we were watching through glass. Ella stirred the ice in her lemonade with the end of her straw, her lips pressed together, her eyes flickering now and then toward the larger table where other children her age swapped stories and passed roles, as if they'd rehearsed this script their entire lives. I leaned toward her, my voice light, hopeful. "Want to walk the yard later? Bet the old swing set's still out back." She nodded. "Maybe after lunch." But her face told me the truth. She didn't want to walk. She wanted acknowledgement, a place, a name card that meant something. She wanted someone to say, "You look just like your dad." Across the room, Madison and her little clique continued their quiet campaign of exclusion, all hushed giggles and sideways glances. Then came the second cut, louder this time, deliberate. She's not a real cousin anyway. The words fell like hailstones, sharp, cold, and utterly unwelcome. A few adults caught the comment, their faces flickering with recognition, but no one intervened. No one stopped her. No one stood. That's the thing about silence, it gives cruelty permission. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but my voice caught in my throat. My body knew this place, this tension. I'd lived here before, where peace was kept by swallowing your pride and shrinking into the wallpaper. I glanced at Ella. She had frozen, fork in hand, eyes fixed on her plate, unmoving. No tears, no protest. But I saw the fracture. I saw the weight of that insult land deep inside her. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the din. She said nothing, just sat staring at the food she no longer wanted. But her silence was not surrender. Without a word, she reached for her purse, the small purple one she'd insisted on bringing, even though I told her it might get in the way. She unzipped it slowly, deliberately, and pulled out something unexpected, a photograph. I recognized it instantly. Mike barefoot on that very porch, grinning wide beneath a sold sign, the day we bought this house together. The day we thought everything was just beginning. On the back he'd written in his lopsided scrawl, "First home, the beginning." She held the photo in her lap for a moment, tracing it with her fingers, then looked up at me. "Can I show them?" Her voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something fierce behind it, an ember of something deeper. I hesitated, my instinct rising to shield her, but I saw in her eyes that this wasn't a request for permission. It was a request for belief. I nodded. Ella stood, her movements slow but unwavering. She walked to the center of the dining room, holding the photograph like it was both armor and truth. Conversation lulled, then faltered, then stopped altogether. Chairs stilled, eyes turned. She raised the photo high, both hands steady. "This is my dad," she said, voice steady and calm. "His name was Michael Morgan, and he used to own this house." Not a whisper, not a demand, just the truth laid bare like a banner. Madison's smirk faltered. Eyes blinked, uncertain. But Ella held her ground. She looked straight ahead and continued. "He was your cousin. That means I'm your cousin too." The power of it was staggering. She wasn't asking to be included. She was claiming a birthright. I rose then, my body's slow heart thudding with something between awe and release. I walked to her side, placed my hand gently on her back. I didn't need to speak. Her words had said everything I'd been too afraid to say. In that moment, my daughter, standing in the center of that cold, quiet room, didn't just demand to be seen. She forced the entire family to remember who they were and who she was. And in that instant, when Ella's voice cut through the silence like sunlight breaking through cloud cover, the very air in the room changed. It was no longer the hush of discomfort or tension, but something deeper, something sacred. It was the kind of silence that follows truth, raw, undeniable, placed in the open, like a mirror too honest to ignore. You could feel the shift, like a current in the room had reversed direction, pulling everyone inward, face to face with something they'd long chosen to forget. She stood there so small, so unwavering, her gaze sweeping from one face to another, not with defiance, but with grace. She repeated herself this time more softly, yet with a certainty that made every syllable land like a stone on still water. "He was your cousin," she said, "and I'm his daughter, which makes me your family too." There were no murmurs, no movement, just stillness dense with reckoning. Aunt Carol, seated at the head of the long table like a monarch who'd grown weary of her crown, slowly removed her glasses and laid them on the linen beside her plate. Her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. Words, it seemed, had finally betrayed her. Uncle Jim, quiet and kind-eyed, the only one who had offered us even the smallest thread of warmth when we arrived, stared at the photo, as though the boy in it, his nephew, his kin, had just walked through the door. His eyes glossed over, not from tears, but from memory, from guilt. And Madison, the niece, whose cruel whisper had lit the match, sat frozen in her chair, her expression slack, her cheeks flooding with a bright, unmissable red. She looked like a child caught pretending to be more grown than she was. I didn't speak immediately. I couldn't. To say something too soon would have broken the fragile magic of what Ella had just done. She had voiced what I had carried in silence for years, but with a clarity and courage I had never been able to conjure. And yet I could feel it, the slow, collective turning of heads, the subtle pivot of energy. All eyes drifting toward me now, waiting to see whether I would follow the path my daughter had so bravely laid, or retreat into the quiet shell I had worn for far too long. I stepped forward. What Ella just said, I began, my voice firmer than I felt, wasn't just a story. It was a claim, a rightful one. She wasn't asking for a place she was taking, back what should never have been taken from her, what was never yours to deny her. I reached for the photograph in Ella's hands, turning it outward so all could see. This was taken the day Mike and I bought this house. He was barefoot happy, and more proud than I'd ever seen him. A month later, we found out we were having Ella. A hush fell heavier. Aunt Carol dropped her gaze to her hands clasped together like someone praying for a different past. Uncle Jim slowly rose his steps, deliberate as he came around the table. I remember that day, he said, his voice a low murmur. Mike called me that night. He was building something here. He was finally happy. Then turning to Ella, his voice thickened. You look just like him. Ella gave him a small, cautious smile, and I felt something within me unclench, a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding for years finally releasing. But not everyone was ready. From the far end of the room, Diane stood, arms folded like armor across her chest. It's been 11 years, she said, her voice sharp but brittle. Why now? Why show up like this? I turned toward her. Not with anger, just a tired kind of truth, because we were invited, and pretending someone doesn't exist doesn't make them disappear. Ella stepped forward, then just a little, her voice calm and clear. I didn't come to take anything, she said. I came to meet the people my dad loved. I wanted to understand what that love looked like. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't waver. That crack, that raw honesty did more than any confrontation could have. It melted whatever invisible wall still stood between us and them. Aunt Carol rose slowly as though the weight of her own regret anchored her. She crossed the room and gently took the photo from Ella's hands. Her fingers lingered on it as she studied the image. He really did love this house, she said, her voice distant and warm with memory. He used to bring his tools every weekend just to fix things that didn't need fixing. Then she looked at me. I should have called you after the funeral. I should have reached out. I just didn't know how. We didn't cry. We didn't fall into some tearful embrace. But there was something trembling in her voice, something real. And that was enough. I didn't come for an apology, I told her quietly. I came because my daughter deserves to know where she comes from. She deserves to be seen not as a guest, as a Morgan. The photo passed from hand to hand like a relic, each person falling quiet as they held it. When it finally returned to Ella, she tucked it back into her purse with a care that spoke volumes, then sat down once more. But this time, everything had changed. Cousin Ben leaned over and offered her the bread basket. Aunt Carol settled at the edge of our table as if she had always belonged there. Even Madison, cheeks still pink with shame, glanced over and offered a small, tentative smile. No thunderous apologies, no dramatic reconciliations. But it was something, a beginning. A subtle, profound shift started not by anger, but by a little girl who knew exactly who she was. The rest of the afternoon softened. The edges of the room blurred. Laughter still floated, but now it felt less exclusive, less performative. The room breathed differently, as if something brittle had been allowed to relax. Ella sat beside me again. No one told us to move. In fact, Aunt Carol pulled out the chair next to her and placed her napkin in her lap, like it had always been her seat. Cousin Ben leaned over once more and asked Ella if she'd like to help with dessert. She turned to me for reassurance, and when I nodded, her face lit up like someone who had been waiting all day just to be asked. She skipped off, hair-bouncing smile unguarded. Watching her, something inside me cracked open, not with pain, but with release, with pride, with gratitude. She hadn't needed validation. She hadn't needed to be accepted. She had needed the space to show them who she was, and she had taken it. People started talking to me again. Uncle Jim brought over a glass of sweet tea and filled it himself. Mike would have been proud of her, he said. I believed him. But the moment that truly changed everything didn't come from an adult. It came from Madison. She approached slowly, 2 slices of chocolate cake balanced on a plate, her hands trembling just enough to betray her nerves. She stopped in front of Ella, offered one of the slices, and whispered, "I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Ella looked up at her eyes, searching. Then, in a voice so steady it could have been carved in stone, she asked, "Would you have said it if you did?" Madison blinked. "No," she said softly. "I don't think I would have." Ella nodded and took the cake. "Okay?" And just like that, a wall began to crumble. Not all at once. Not with hugs or tears. But with something better truth and a willingness to change. And in a room full of adults who had failed to speak, the first person to step forward was another child. Later, as the sun melted into the tree line, Aunt Carol stood at the edge of the porch calling me over. Her voice had lost its edge. It was softer now, more human. "I wasn't fair to you," she said. "When Mike died, I let that loss close the door instead of opening it wider. You shouldn't have had to raise her alone without this part of him. And she shouldn't have been kept away from this place from us." I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. Her words weren't perfect, but they were real. They weren't excuses. They were confessions, and those matter most of all. "I've kept this for years," Aunt Carol murmured, her voice low and tinged with something like reverence as she reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Her fingers fumbled briefly before emerging with a small object, an old key weathered with time, its once polished brass now dulled to a muted bronze. She pressed it into my hand, her gaze steady. "It's the original key to the house," she said. "I always thought, maybe if Ella ever wanted to come back, it should be waiting. For her." I turned the key over in my palm, its cool metal grounding me, pressing into skin that warmed instantly beneath its touch. It felt like more than just a key. It felt like an apology, like a welcome, like a bridge laid across a chasm we'd spent years staring into from opposite sides. "I don't know if she'll want it." I admitted, my voice nearly lost to the sounds of dusk settling around us, the rustle of wind through leaves, the creak of old porch boards beneath settling feet. "She might," Carol replied gently. "Maybe not now, but one day." I looked out across the yard, and there she was, my daughter, my Ella, perched on the old porch swing beneath the wide sweep of twilight. She laughed, easy and unself-conscious, surrounded by the very cousins who only hours ago had acted as though she were a ghost among them. And now she sat in their circle, not forcing, not pleading, just existing, as though she had always belonged. That laugh. It wasn't quite Mike's, but it was close enough to twist something deep inside me. A chord I hadn't heard, struck in over a decade, and in that moment, it hit me this wasn't just about a seat at the table or names on a family tree. This was about reclaiming a legacy, rebuilding something from the shattered edges of what he'd left behind. As we packed the car that evening, Ella cradled the photo she'd carried like a torch. "Can I keep it in my purse?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes searching mine for something deeper. "Of course," I said, brushing her cheek with a smile. She glanced back at the house once more, then looked up at me, her voice quiet. "I think he would have been proud of me." Pride welled in my throat, thick and warm. "He would have been in awe of you," I whispered. And as we descended the steps of the home that had once held our hopes and now held something like closure, I realized the silence that had long encased us was no longer with us. Not because it had been broken by noise, but because it had been replaced by presence, by connection, by truth. The car ride home passed in quiet reverie, not the heavy aching kind that follows loss, but the soft hush that comes after something meaningful has run its course. Ella sat in the passenger seat, her seatbelt snug across her chest, one hand resting protectively over the photo in her lap. Outside, the sun sank beneath the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose, casting a gentle glow over the world that made everything seem softer, kinder. She didn't speak for a long while, and I didn't prod. I let the silence stretch companionable and full. Halfway down the winding road that carved through the woods like a memory we were slowly leaving behind, she finally spoke. "I thought it would feel different." I glanced over at her. "Different how?" "I don't know," she said, with a shrug, eyes still tracking the trees as they slipped past like shadows. "I thought I'd either feel like I belonged, or like I never wanted to go back. But it's kind of both, and neither." I smiled because I understood exactly what she meant. Family, real family, isn't always an open-armed embrace or a photo-ready moment. Sometimes it's a knot you keep picking, at hoping to loosen it just enough to breathe. Sometimes it's a fight, even when it shouldn't be. You don't have to decide how you feel today, I told her. You did something brave. And being brave doesn't always feel good right away. It just feels necessary. She nodded and leaned her head against the window, letting the rhythm of the road lull her into a stillness I hadn't seen all day. I turned my thoughts inward, replaying every moment, not just the photo she'd held up like a sword, or the silence that had greeted it, but what had come after. The shift, the small gestures. Jim filling my glass, Carol sitting beside us, Madison bringing cake with trembling hands and tentative words. For years I had let the silence speak for us. I believed not showing up would protect us. That absence was easier than rejection. But I was wrong. Ella hadn't gone to be tolerated. She had gone to be known. And in doing so, she reminded me that identity isn't something granted, it's something you claim. In the weeks that followed, small things began to change. A box arrived in the mail, postmarked from Aunt Carol. Inside were snapshots of Mike as a boy, a tattered high school yearbook with scribbled notes in the margins, and a letter she'd written after his funeral but never sent. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it away. Madison Braver now sent a short video through her mom's phone. In it, she said she wanted to learn more about Mike. And Ella, sitting on the edge of her bed, recorded a reply proudly holding up her favorite photo of her dad. This was his favorite hoodie, she said with a shy smile. Mom says he wore it even in the summer. We didn't suddenly become part of every group text. We didn't start attending every Sunday dinner. That wasn't the goal. The point was that the narrative no longer ended in silence. The door once bolted shut had been opened, and Ella had stepped through it on her own terms. Then one quiet afternoon she walked into the living room holding the old key in her hand. "Do you think I could live there someday?" she asked. I looked at her, not surprised, just deeply, achingly moved. "If that's what you want," I said, "yes, it'll always be a part of your story." She turned the key over in her palm, its tarnished curves catching the light. "Then I'll keep it safe," she said with a solemn little smile. And as I watched her, it struck me when she stood in that room and held up that photo, she didn't just shift something in them. She shifted something in me. I stopped apologizing for how things had ended. I stopped carrying the shame I had never earned. Because we were never the ones on the outside. We were the missing part of the story, and now finally that story was whole. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when you stood alone or were finally seen, take a moment and let it live beyond the screen. Share your story in the comments. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong until you claimed your place out loud? Did someone speak truth when you couldn't? Your words matter, your voice matters. And if you want more stories like this about family truth and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground, hit that like button. Subscribe, turn on notifications. Because the stories we tell shape the stories we live. Thank you for watching.